right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we are again attendees. If you have a question, type it in the chat window, or you can reduce the speaker volume on in your auditorium and come up to the microphone. Make it short and quick so that we can get those answered in a crisp way. And I would like to encourage more questions. So, just let's do that, or let's do an email to invitations@kvimis.co.in. That way we will be able to get that transmitted over to the presenter. Okay, coming to the next presenter, Mr. David Harper, a good mentor of mine and a longtime friend of mine. I first of all welcome you, sir, to this webinar. A unique effort that we have been. This is the second year. We have a good panel and a good set of audience today. I welcome you, sir. Hello, can you hear me, sir? Okay.
Yeah, good to be here, Kumar.
Okay, great. So I'm going to quickly change the presentation over to you. And Mr. David Harper is the Director of Network Infrastructure and Security, specializing in design, execution, and maintenance of all elements of IT infrastructure for $1 billion company in the United States of America. That's BlueCross and BlueShield of South Carolina. He has a special emphasis on the development of critical data delivery systems, such as DMZ design and business continuity implementations. His technical and managerial team leadership is a strength. Communications on verbal and written are sharply developed and consistently deployed. He has a proven ability, that is, to drive solutions to conclusion within the context of a win-win approach to conflict resolution. He is an intense and experienced team builder who operates within the consistent framework of integrity and focused drive to a culture of results. His specialties are network and server architecture, security, disaster recovery, high availability, project management, budget preparation, and engineering personnel supervision, to include virtual team supervision. Sir, I welcome you to this webinar again, and the dais is yours.
Okay, and Kumar, just to verify, do you see the appropriate screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Very clear. Right. And do we have video? We would like to see you. No worries.
Well, let's see what we can do. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think we'll press
on. If you have it good to go, you know, some of the attendees asked, well, should we, you know, where do we see him again? So.
Well,
no worries,
I'm not sure how to pop up a video, so I'll skip that for the time being.
There is a little icon. No worries, sir. Just let's get it. Yep, let's get it going.
All right. So again, Dr. Coleman segued well into the conversation that I wanted to have with you today, and I first of all I wanted to thank Kumar for that very gracious introduction, and for Dr. Coleman for taking some time to enlighten us, especially me. I thought it was a very interesting conversation based around the dialectic process and a lot of the changes that are going on in terms of globalization. And while globalization has certainly sped up in recent years, I think, and I've got sort of a funny story for you. I don't think that it's relatively something that's new. Globalization has been something that's been sort of creeping up on us for thousands of years. It's just gotten quick lately. And since the topic that I'm going to be speaking to you on is really around sort of state-sponsored cyber espionage, if you will, and sort of some things that you ought to know if you're managing a business around trying to protect your business from the risks from your competitors, especially those competitors that are going to attempt to extract critical information from your systems in order to be able to use that to better you in the industries that you compete in. I wanted to give you a kind of a short, funny story. India has a long history, as does China, associated with trade, and going back to primarily, I think, a lot of silk used to come through that part of the world at one point in time and make its way to Europe, and tons and tons of gold made its way back in the times when the Romans liked to wear a lot of silk. And one of the funny things is there were some middlemen in the middle, and they were called the Parthians. And the Parthians, in a great example of corporate espionage, actually took the raw silk weaving from the Chinese as it came down the Silk Road, and they unwound it, unweaved it, and weaved it into a much finer, more gossamer feeling sort of silk. And they resold it not only to the Romans, but they sold that same fabric, that very light silk fabric, back to the Chinese and the Indians. And they told the Chinese that the Romans also had silkworms, but it was just a sort of a better variety of silkworm, and they kept that corporate espionage and that competitive advantage for hundreds and hundreds of years along the Silk Road, until eventually somebody figured out now the Romans really didn't have better silkworms. And so from that, moving forward, I think I want to talk to you just a bit about the fact that as you're running your own businesses, and you will be competitive, and especially when you are global, as all businesses will be in the day and age that we live, if you get big enough and you're interesting enough, there will be other governments who have a vested interest in taking a look at you and applying corporate espionage against your organization in order to try to make sure that they can steal some of your competitiveness. And as with Dr. Coleman, if somebody does have a question and they want to chat, they can do that at any time, and this is a fairly informal briefing. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. All right. So Marcus Carey came out and he said, truth is, good espionage program is vital to any country's success. As was pointed out earlier in terms of Gigawatt from Dr. Coleman, right? There are risks with globalization. We are tied together, and we are tied together with not just places and cultures, but with technology. And the world has, as Friedman pointed out, flattened. And what you then see when that happens is that the spread of knowledge, especially that important knowledge that separates competitive business organizations, is valuable. A long time ago, I think you could see that what was valuable 1,000 years ago might have been land or animals. Then with the Industrial Revolution, you see what is valuable is people's time, right, in terms of their ability to go do things. And now I think we're at a state where you see that what's really valuable is information. And your business will have information. You'll be responsible for that information. And I think that, again, as Dr. Coleman pointed out, one of the things that has to happen is good governance around that information. As business leaders, it's going to be critical for you to be able to understand what that means. And I'm a pragmatic person. I'm an engineer by trade, and I run a compliance program. And we are a compliance program that sees a lot of activity from foreign governments. But I want to talk to you about a way that it was done in the past that probably, in terms of thesis and antithesis and eventually into synthesis, didn't work very well, and see where we're going, where maybe something works a little bit better. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about, we'll start with, not to pick on them, but we'll start with your neighbor, China, just north of the border. And I want to make sure that just some things out there. 760 companies, Business Week showed cyber Cold War hacking. So in my company is one of them. I want to kind of flesh that out a little bit because it may sound like, gosh, China's trying to target your company or my company, this company. The fact is that China and some of the other state-sponsored actors out there, they're targeting every company. They're actually just targeting every IP address. And so, for instance, the company that I work for, and what we see on a daily basis is there are hundreds and hundreds of attempts at espionage that are what I call generic attempts. They don't really know what my company is, but they try to hack through certain parts of our environment to be able to see what's there because it's done on such a massive scale. And only when it's done on that massive scale do we have indications of state sponsorship. Criminal activities have been around, and now there are activists who do hacking. But when you see the types of just blanket attempts to be able to infiltrate organizations across IP address space, rest assured that's something that's being done at a state level. And that's why I think we go to the second bullet, which is that the main cyber threats that we see in large institutions are from state actors. And again, I give a note, European Affairs, November 2011. There are criminal enterprises, of course, that are threats, and they try to act on vulnerabilities quite frequently. But the major threats are coming from governments. This has certainly been evidenced recently in what you heard as the Stuxnet virus, where certain state actors launched very sophisticated espionage attacks against the Iranian uranium enrichment program, and did it in very clever ways that actually become part of militarization of those sorts of cyber attacks. And I think this is a change. And so when you go into, again, into that process of the dialectic, the biggest change has happened is that there's been this evolution away from sort of an individualistic or cowboy hobby sort of security threat, and from criminal enterprises to full-blown state-sponsored industrial espionage. And I would point out that it's not just militarization; it is industrial espionage. They're an example of that. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, which runs a very, very active industrial espionage, not just military. They do that because the mission of the PLA, as with the mission of many of these state actors, is to ensure both military and economic security. It's an understanding that what they're looking for is your intellectual property right and competitive advantage in terms of negotiations, contracting, and raw materials. And they have a massive effort underway to do that. And they're not the only ones that are doing it. So if you have a company and you are governance in that organization, it is incumbent upon you to think through that risk posture and make sure that things that are important to you are protected. And just the last bullet that you see there is, of course, is that Russia's intelligence services are conducting these. I don't mean to point out these two. These are the primary attacks, but every country's good espionage program is out there, and so there are really nobody out there that doesn't have their hands dirty with these things. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the way it used to work, right? So, and it may sound kind of strange. FISMA is a law, right? And it is a law that was passed, I think, in the late 1990s. Basically, what that law is in the United States, it gives a list of controls, technical and administrative, that must be in place to secure a federal system, a U.S. government system. So it was the first attempt through a law and then through the adoption of federal regulation to lay out a framework for how one ought to be able to secure an information system so that threats out there could be mitigated and competitive information kept safe. And of course, when you're talking about the government, which there's a lot of private industry that follows based off of the NIST guidance that came from that FSMA law that was generated to tell private organizations and government organizations how to be able to do that. And NIST is a searchable term. You can certainly find lots of information around those controls. Kumar is very familiar with NIST and ISO because these were controls that when we did work for the federal government, we were required to follow. Now, I'm not going to get into the controls because that would, it's the morning over there and it's late at night here, and it would put me to sleep to try to do that. So, but I would tell you this. They're kind of written in a way that requires a lot of documentation, as you could imagine, from any government organization. And so you're trying to document your way to some level of compliance around the system to show people that you've dotted some I's and crossed some T's. And Kumar can offline tell you some interesting stories about the sheer mass of documentation that at one time he was responsible to maintain and send to government institutions to prove compliance.
Okay.
And, Kumar, we're good?
Yes, sir, we are good.
Okay. So paperwork, this is the fatal flaw, right? So if you went to antithesis, we would say paperwork just doesn't stop state-sponsored espionage, right? Filling out forms and documentation and bringing in a whole lot of people with initials after their name from high-priced consulting firms probably doesn't do a lot to keep the Chinese from hacking through your defenses and stealing the information that you think is valuable. And I think that there's a recognition of that, if you will, an antithesis that's come forward and a new synthesis that's come out of it to steal from Dr. Coleman's model. And really, and again, as you can see in bullet number 2, in addition to paperwork, the controls that were there ultimately just weren't tied to operational security, which is the actual monitoring and securing of the systems that you use to process your information. And it sounds like maybe more than it is, but you're all familiar with a patch, right? You patch a system when you have a software flaw that is in a piece of code that's recognized by a vendor or somebody who writes the code as being a software flaw that has a security vulnerability that could be acted upon. They release code to fix that, and normally that's a patch, and you guys patch your systems probably all the time, and you try to maintain those patches in order so that that you don't have a lot of vulnerabilities on the systems. And FSMA really doesn't address those things. They don't address software flaws very well, and they don't address how things ought to be configured, and it does not address things like how it ought to be monitored to see if there's any near real-time activity. And so that was kind of, came up as being, this isn't going to work for us. And to sort of outline that here when we say that, despite the improvement reported by the agencies on the paperwork, and these are U.S. government agencies that said we're doing great on our paperwork. Our communications and infrastructure just wasn't secured with the paperwork, and so the focus is now moving away from more of the paper policies to more of a near real-time security practice, and I think that's a much-needed shift, and it moves from away from a culture of paperwork compliance to more of a performance-based model that focuses on that continuous monitoring and managing of those security risks. And really what that means to the folks in the room, and it's fairly straightforward, which is good policies are important and good processes are important. But in addition to those things and in cooperation with those things, you have to have a very active engagement to watch the configuration of your systems, the patching of your systems, and to control what software is loaded on those systems. And you have to monitor those systems to make sure that you understand what behavior is occurring on them in order to give yourself a reasonable economic assurance that information that might be valuable to your organization sort of stays there. Now, so everybody kind of got this recognition maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but everybody said, well, gosh, that's really hard to do. You know, it's easy for us to fill out the paperwork. We know how to do that, but we really don't know what to do about the rest of this sort of continuous monitoring and management of risks in a reasonable way. And kind of people threw up their hands and said, well, you know, really can't be done, so it's easier to do the paper. All right. So we got some hope from down under, right? So the guys that a little bit south of where you're at were able to do some very simple things, and they're what they call the Defense Signals Directorate, right? And this was in response to a lot of state-sponsored espionage that was coming from China, having to do with a lot of their negotiations they were having around raw materials and resources. They've really identified and deployed just 4 simple protections. And these 4 things, if you do them well and you do them consistently, and you make sure that these are your policy and your procedures around them, are actually surprisingly effective against targeted intrusions. Now, it's not going to stop extraordinarily sophisticated state actors like the folks who developed Stuxnet, but it's going to stop the vast bulk of state-sponsored espionage, which, quite frankly, is not all that sophisticated, but it's just massive in scale. And so now we're going to talk about what the new synthesis is. And remember, and this is what we said, that Defense Signals Directorate indicated foreign spooks making 700 attempts per month this year. So it just goes back to try to qualify. This is going on today. It's going on a massive scale. It goes on against every IP address range. It's publicly accessible. And if you're in a business today, you people listening in the audience, there are people out there who are trying to get into your environments, and they don't even know what they are a lot of times because it's just such a blanket sort of a strategy. And what the DSD took a look at and what they did is they looked at case studies, and you heard Dr. Coleman saying casework is where he sees the most value, and that's what they did. They went back and they looked through many years worth of intrusions, and they said, hey, well, what could we have done to prevent these intrusions that we have seen in the past, right? Not trying to stop what we're going to do in the future, but what would be some simple things that we could have done? And what they really did was came up with a set of 30-some-odd strategies, the top 4 of which would have prevented at least 70% of the intrusions that they had seen previously. And if you had implemented all 31 of them, you would have gotten up to 85% of the intrusions associated with attacks that had historically been successful. And so we're going to talk about these top 4 because you may someday be in a place, if you're not already, where you're going to be making a business decision around what you ought to do to make sure that the risk to your organization in terms of your compliance, and especially in terms of state-sponsored industrial espionage, especially since I would seem that India, as the 10th largest economy in the world, and being very competitive with your neighbor to the north, you are a target for those types of attack, as are the USA. And these are relatively simple things. The first thing is we're going to talk about is, and I'm going to mention patching, and more patching in a way that implies all of your patches for all of your vulnerabilities, and all of that patching being done within days, not weeks, not months, not years. A vulnerability gets worse, like bad news. It does not get better with time. The longer that a vulnerability exists, and a vulnerability in terms of the patch, right, is a software flaw that the vendor has in his code that he has developed a correction for. And so we're finding now that you have the capability in our systems, even in very complex environments, and Kumar can relate to the complex environments that we run. You can get patching down even in complex environments to as little as 7 days. What the Defense Signals Directorate indicates is if you really wanted to do well, you would have it within 2. It sounds fairly simple. I don't want to oversell it, but patching is the first line of defense to be able to keep your data intact. And you can do a lot of other things, but if you spend your time and effort with a comprehensive, valid, very fast patching deployment program, that's all money and time well spent for both your applications and your operating systems. The next thing is the use of administrative account access. You know, I know that this can be a problem for some folks where they have a system, a platform that's such a way, and your applications in such a way that you get the use of least privilege, so that you have the least number of people who have access to everything that you can possibly there, with the intent that if you ever have somebody who attacks your system, said in case study would be effective, is if one were to implement something called application whitelisting. Oh, we've got some pretty music in the background. There we go. And application whitelisting is a simple term, guys. Really all that means is that you have a certain number of applications that run on your systems, and you know when they are, and you allow them to run. Anything that you don't know on your system, you disallow the use. It's a technical control on the system, and you just do not let code run on the systems that you have not identified. And there are many tools out there that can help you identify those things and do application whitelisting and discovery of applications. And if you just look at those 4 things going forward, along with some good policy and some good procedure to implement those things, then the vast bulk of the threat that you have out there.
Sir, we have 5 minutes to go, sir.
Sounds good. I think I'm on my last slide, Kumar. All right, so what can you do, right? And I got interesting here. NATO looks to team with India to fight cybercrime. No surprise here. U.S. and India being the largest democracy in the world, need to figure out in a global economy how to cooperate. And this goes back again to the idea of place, right? It doesn't matter that the country next door to you is pretty much involved in those cyber issues, because in a cyber world, we're all sort of equally close together. And so from that, I think what you can do is understand that the world is changing, that your economic viability will hinge around the protection of your economic information. And these are basic principles that if you look to, you can have a reasonable assurance of protection, and that don't get caught up providing a lot of paper instead of that reasonable assurance for your customers and your countrymen. And lastly, of course, democracies face challenges that are common, and we can have a common dialogue associated with those things to work together in order to make sure that as a global economy, we all prosper, as I guess you could see from Gigawatt in terms of World 3.0. And that's the way that we can all improve our quality of life. And with that, Kumar, that is the end of the slideshow.
Awesome. Okay. So let's open the floor for questions. Attendees, I'm going to enable microphone on all of them. And if you have questions, please come up to the microphone and ask. Are there any questions from the attendees? Please come up to the microphone and ask.
Hello.
Hello, yes?
Hello.
Yes?
Sir, am from Business School of Management.
Go ahead, sir.
Boy, I'm having a hard time hearing the gentleman.
Okay, Mr.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. I'll try to comprehend that, sir.
Also, you have said that paperless policy can be effective for other products. But as far as your industry is concerned, at the time of taking ISO and other certifications, those organizations are interesting for the paper work and documentation on behalf of the group members of the
Okay. Dr. Dharma, we are having difficult time hearing you, sir. The audio is, there's a lot of echo in the room. Can you come close to the microphone and talk a little bit slowly, please?
I really can't hear him, Kumar. If you can hear and try to help me out.
Okay, sir. While we have another question from another location. We have a question from another location. So in the meantime, can you type that question in the chat window, and we will shoot that question over. Any questions from? I know there was a question or two from KV Institute of Management students. Hello?
Kumar, is there somewhere I should see the questions in the chat?
Yes, sir. Actually, one of the questions here says, okay, right here. Is there an, okay. There is a questions window, sir, that appears. How do I make it big? Hold on a second. Okay, is that an international standard for securities and information security and compliance? International standard for information security and compliance.
The answer is I think is the closest that you're going to get is going to be the ISO 27001. Again, it is a framework, and I know, Kumar, you're familiar with that ISO specification. And it is a series of best practices. We're beyond that in the sense that we are talking about specific configuration items and a configuration baseline and a patching and a monitoring solution. So national standard associated with how one performs those activities.
Okay, great. Any other question? Okay, there was a partial question. Let me see if I can reword that. What are the complications involved in going paperless, and if we go paper, will we avoid cyber threats?
Yeah, I think what they're trying to come to is obviously if you store your sensitive information on paper, it's a lot harder for it to geographically sort of move around. And so that, but that's not saying that you're safe. There are lots of folks who try to dig into waste bins, if you will, of people who put paper in the trash and find information, and those are the people who are going to put it online or sell it or use it in terms of industrial espionage. So I think from that perspective, whether it be printed or it be electronic, if it's important to you and it has value, then you have to find a way to be able to manage the life cycle of that asset and to secure it properly through that life cycle.
Okay, great. Those are the two questions from Wisdom School of Management. Sir, we don't see the question here, so please shoot that question via email to invitations@kvimis.co.in. and we will get that sent over to Mr. Harper and get that answered. The next time, let us get that those questions typed up in the chat window so that we can ask the question. And I'm hoping that I asked the right, put the question in the right way. the last one that you had. Okay, that's the time that we have. That's all we have right now. And I want to thank Mr. Harper, my mentor, and it's always good to hear from you, sir. And I thank you for your time.
Wonderful work, Kumar. Anytime.
Thank you.